Awesome. We're live here, jumping into a discussion about the role of orchestration and composability. I'm going to give a few seconds here just for the other live streams to connect and see if a few more people are coming in. Just give me 1 second and let me see if we've connected on everything. Okay, I think we're good. So welcome everyone. We're really excited to run this panel here, chatting about orchestration and how it fits into composability. I'd love to start with just introducing the panel and everyone who's going to bring in some opinions. I'm John Voigt, CEO, co-founder of Agility CMS, and been getting very involved in MACH Alliance and MACH architectures for quite some time, but really a lot more lately. And we're seeing a huge shift in people's viewpoint on orchestration and how it fits in. And we have some experts here that I'd love to run around. Maybe Joel, since you're a co-worker with me, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, and I'll call it the next people. We'll go around.
Sure. I'm CTO here at Agility with John. John and I've worked together for upwards of more than 20 years. And from a headless CMS point of view, orchestration is really important for us right now, because a lot of folks are moving from one system to another and bringing multiple systems together. And so I'm actually really interested in this panel, not only to show my opinion, but also to hear what some of the other folks have to say about how they're working with this sort of the orchestration term and bringing all these things together.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel. Chris, you want to jump in there?
Absolutely. I'm Chris Bach. I'm co-founder of Netlify, with developer platform, and also sit in the MACH Alliance, where I'm a board member, and help create the enabler category, and yeah, have been doing this whole headless composable MACH thing for about a decade now.
Awesome, love it. And Casper, at the one person at nighttime right now, you're away on the other side.
Indeed. Thank you so much. My name is Casper Rasmussen. I'm Global SVP of Technology at Valtech, heading up our business for MACH and the Composable Enterprise. And then I'm also the president of the MACH Alliance. And orchestration, as Joel said, is a very, very important topic these days, because everybody wants scale of their investment, and I see it fitting quite well in there.
Love it. And last but not least, Sana, love you.
All right. Thank you so much for having me join this conversation. Sana Remeke, CEO and co-founder of Consia. Consia is also a digital experience orchestration platform. So we fit right into that category. We recently joined the MACH Alliance as well. So very happy to take part in this conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I think we should backtrack a little bit, because we have already used the word orchestration in a couple terms here very quickly. And there's a lot of buzzwords going around, and some of the people in the audience here are probably very clear on what it means, and other people are completely lost. So maybe we can just go around, because I want to see how aligned you guys all are as well. What is orchestration to you, and how do you see it fitting into the composable kind of landscape? Sandy, you want to go first?
Sure. I love this topic. As many of you know, I'm probably the most prolific writer and speaker about this topic out there. So I think the reason why orchestration is such a confusing term is because it requires some context. When we're talking about orchestration, you got to describe what you're orchestrating. And what I believe we're orchestrating, and what we're talking about here, is orchestrating an experience. And when you're orchestrating an experience in a composable tech stack, that means that the data and content that's required to build that experience is coming from a whole bunch of different places. And that data and content needs to be made available to the front end in a cohesive, in a connected way to build that experience. And to me, in order for a platform to do orchestration, it has to be able to connect to all of those backend data sources that need orchestration. It needs to be able to stitch data together. It needs to be able to chain API calls from different systems and provide that control to the business user with some business logic and conditional logic that the business user can control to build that experience. So I think without orchestration, I don't think you can really have a truly composable tech stack.
Love that. Awesome. Okay, Casper, what about your perspective from the Valtech side, where you guys are helping customers, actually roll out the implementations?
Yeah, no, and I completely agree in there being many different definitions behind the work or the word orchestration. Like you're putting it very well, Sana, with regards to the customer experience and the actual stitching of data and the enablement of the the touch points, but orchestration is also a people process component, right? Because we also see the word orchestration coming into developer workflows. We see the word orchestration coming into collaboration between people, for instance, around content supply chain. So orchestration has many meanings in this space, but it's workflow. It's at the end of the day workflow, and in that workflow sits data, people, optimization, like those types of terms too. But I think it's most frequently used up until this point in the actual orchestration of the experience. Like, how do you enable that content, data, and experience combination that Sana spoke to?
Right. And how about you, Chris? Any different perspectives? Similar? What's your thought?
Absolutely. So yeah, first of all, like echoing that it means a lot of different things, right? I think within the last, I was just thinking in my head, like I think it's within the last 6 days, I spoke with both Forrester and Gardner around orchestration specifically meaning a lot of different things, right? Like I don't think there is not one definition, right? I think when it comes to composable architecture, if you look at MACH Alliance and how this has arrived in the enterprises, we've had sort of traditionally a big focus on components. And what I mean by components is like a module, right? A commerce module, right? And it needs to be multi-tenant SaaS, and it needs to be API first, and so on, right? And I think now what we're sort of finding out is that just choosing the right headless components is not enough. How they actually interact is very important, especially if you're trying to do something that scales. So if it's a small greenfield project, it becomes less relevant. Once you're trying to adopt composable architecture as a digital strategy, you need to update how you do operations and orchestration as well. It needs to be redefined. If you stick to your guns and do things in the old way, you're not going to get those promises that composable holds. And the premier amount then of things like faster time to market. And just choosing the right headless API is not going to give you that, right? So I think that there's a headline there. Netlify started 10 years ago, and we saw like the precursor to this was really sort of the decoupling of the front end and the back end, because before then each monolith would output a front end as part of it, right? So you had to choose one or the other, and it was much more scalable. It was faster. It would be more secure as well, because those large monolithic surface areas wouldn't have to run and build for every visitor. At the same time, it would give developers superpowers, right? Because you could now publish things directly rather than having to implement it into a backend. You didn't have to fit those templates, right? And it would also pave the path to composable architecture, which is so valuable for these companies, because when you have a monolith with 37 different functionalities in the old world, and I'm being a little coarse here, right? But you want to change one of them, you change the monolith, right? That's why it's a 10-year cycle, and it's so painful, right? And you're like, well, I wish this thing just had more language variations, but we need that. We're going into different markets. I guess I'm getting a new monolith, right? And you build it out, you port the content, you flip the switch, and 18 months later, you're live on dated software, right? And in a composable world, you would only change out that one component, right? And that's why it has such a value as a business proposition, right? And so what we saw at Netlify here was like, hey, if it's so much better, why isn't everyone doing it? And there needed to be a larger ecosystem. We were like 2 players then. Today it's more than 3,500 players in the space, right? So you actually can now. We support all those as a community, as an ecosystem. We support basically any use case today to build with a composable architecture. Back then, you couldn't even do e-commerce at all, for example, because all the commerce players were only making their services available as a monolith, right? But what one thing was the ecosystem. The other thing was workflow. So this comes back to exactly what Casper said, right? This orchestration really is about workflows. And so the basic notion was that, hey, before my CMS was also a template engine, a build tool, glue code, server environment program, had all those things in it. Now it's a headless API. How does that even know that everything else exists? Is that coordinated and output into actually tangible digital experiences? And so on, right? And you had a whole deployment pipeline, you had hosting, you had all these different things that needed to be orchestrated, needed a new way of working, right? And so that's where we and Netlify said, okay, we have to provide that workflow, right? And so that is an orchestration layer. And now that has been expanded into saying, okay, well, the next level here is to be able to take all kinds of content sources and so on, just like Sana was talking about, right? And being able to connect them as well, right? So we do that as well today. But I think the reality here is that for me, and I think I would imagine all of us agree, like at the end of the day, orchestration really is the You have the right components. Now they need to work together. And then there might be different ways of doing that, right? And different takes on what goes where. But I think the big headline here, and what's really important for these enterprises to take away, anyone listening here, is that if you do not consider proper orchestration, if you think that you can just go about doing your infrastructure in the same way you did before, and just win by choosing the right composable components, you won't. And all the pushback we see in the MACH Alliance as well is almost always from people that didn't implement it holistically, right? They just chose the components, and then they didn't get the proposed benefits, right? And they're like, hey, why is this taking so long and so on, right? Well,
and then they blame it on the wrong thing, but it was really just the orchestration part of it was not done right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Chris. And Joel, what about your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot that hasn't been said from the other panelists, but what I bring to it is similar to what you were saying, Chris, is when we work with customers, a lot of times the pushback from orchestration is from internal IT and development teams who think they already have it figured out. And maybe they do. They understand potentially multiple API sources. I've got data coming from different places. Oftentimes there's a custom piece of data that is maybe sitting in a database. And what we talk about is like, well, you probably don't have like a good API to your custom data yet, because that might not be part of what you needed before. So at the very least, we want folks to be working with data in an API format, and like it's usually some kind of REST, maybe it's GraphQL, something like that. Getting even to that part can be tricky with internal teams, but then now the idea is, okay, you're going to connect these things and use them in the various front ends, like you were saying, Santa, in an experience. I don't know that word translates that great to every sort of enterprise type customer, because they have their own use cases in their mind about how data is going to flow. And it's really hard to get folks to kind of get out of that mindset to think of, well, wouldn't it be nice if it was a more configurable experience for how that data is flowing? And I think that's where I think we can help folks get introduced to the idea of orchestration more, as like, hey, you can have a tool that you can go into, and it's not just hard coded somewhere and like back in files where all the stuff is kind of connected together. I think the idea of that's what glue code is kind of seeming like. But imagine that you could have workflow to determine how these things work together, as well as like it's an actual administration tool you can go into. And then, it's not an easy conversation to have that though, because a lot of times folks are also confusing this with like moving to cloud, moving away from their monolith thing. So there's a lot of stuff going on in their heads. What we've started to do is talk about composable as, hey, just do phase one. Let's get you started on the journey, and then we'll add in orchestration. And I'm not sure that that's the best way to do it, but it's certainly, I think, the most approachable way. So it's not putting too many conversations on the table as we sort of move into like a transformation to composable systems.
I can add just some thoughts to what you're saying here, Joel. So, orchestration is something that in principle has always been happening in every step. Yep. It's not the concept is not new. In the past, the monolith used to have orchestration happening right within the monolith. Yep. Then when we went to composable, customers started to build their own orchestration layers. Sometimes they would build a BFF, which is very specific to a specific channel, specific experience. And so it's not that we're introducing a brand new topic to composability. I think what we're saying is that this is now a build versus a buy argument.
Yeah.
So should you build it or should you buy it? Right. Yeah. And the same build it versus buy argument, I think, goes for any component within the composable tech stack. You can always build a CMS as well, but should you build a CMS?
Yeah. And I think this is a great transition into my next question, which is, now that there's orchestration platforms or layers and things that are a bit more like you could buy them, the real question is, when should you use an orchestration layer and when should you not? Because it's just, you said, Santa, like people have been orchestrating systems for a long time, but they haven't enabled the ability of composability where you can swap things out easily, or you can change, or you can pivot and those type of things. So, but a small shop that comes in, do they really need an orchestration layer, or is this an enterprise thing? Is it a middle tier? Like, where is that kind of fit in? Maybe Santa, if you want to continue that, like what, obviously you guys provide that platform, but when would a customer not be a good fit, or when would you say this is a perfect fit and not?
So orchestration sits in the middle, right? It sits in the middle of the front end and the back end. You could have multiple front ends and you could have multiple back ends. As soon as you have more than one of anything, orchestration has a place in it. If you have the future, if you believe that at some point you're going to add more services in the back end, if you believe at some point you're going to have more touch points in the front end, it makes sense to have a configurable orchestration there. And one thing that I want to actually clarify when we talk about orchestration, it's not about just exposing an existing system with an API. That's just making a system ready to be orchestrated. That's not the same as actually orchestrating the backend APIs and the data. So what, I actually believe that orchestration is necessary as soon as you are planning on building a composable stack, which means multiple backends, and as soon as you have more than one front end. So that, typically what's happening in a composable tech stack today is that a lot of that integration, that business logic, the stitching of data, all of that ends up happening in the rendering layer. Whether that happens in the server-side rendering or client-side rendering, that's not the question. Point is, it's still very much focused on a specific channel. So you end up rebuilding a monolith. So if you want to get away from coupling your back end from your front end, then the only real way to do that is to create an abstraction between that front end and the back end. So that abstraction can be used and configured in different ways for different channels rather than coded in different ways for different channels. So that's our perspective on that.
Just sort of dig into that for a second though, because the idea of building an abstraction to me is a little bit vague. So what you're saying is the orchestration layer itself becomes itself an API that your system can access as a backend. So it's like bringing together a centralized backend for everything to go through.
That's right. And it provides one API. We call it the experience API. And that experience API is very, some people say that's not opinionated. It actually is opinionated. You're calling the experience API from a specific front end with specific configurations. You're asking it to give me this experience with all of its components. A different front end can call it with a completely different configuration. But the idea is that that orchestration layer is being able to configure, to be configured to call different backends and stitched data together in a whole bunch of different ways depending on the need of the front end. Right. So instead of calling all the backend systems individually, you're going through one API.
And what about you, Casper? Maybe you can add some insight as someone who's implemented. Probably in the past, you guys would possibly, I know we have with customers, they built their own orchestration layer. Right?
Absolutely.
So when did they build their own? When did they buy one? What, maybe it's.
Or do you build them for folks?
If we do,
you
we
absolutely
do.
do.
But I think, again, we need to determine the type of orchestration we're doing.
Right.
Because I agree with the low-code, no-code approach to make sure you can optimize and control your front end and your experience. Any business deserves that. Don't get me wrong. But there are some other orchestration bits that you also need to put in place. Observability, making sure you can trace and correlate issues in your stack. That's a workflow of data too. That is very, very important that you don't want to build yourself. There are tools that we've put into place in enterprise stacks ever since the dinosaurs, I was about to say. That has been a key consideration. It's a foundational concern that you must design for. But then there's also the orchestration of the people. In how do you actually facilitate, call it marketing workflows across a plethora of different systems? Again, historically, we've seen like these content platforms doing all sorts of different content types, whether it's product information through to digital assets down to UGC and actual marketing content that is now spread across a best of breed ecosystem. So even orchestrating the people around the actual processes and the tasks and the workflows that needs to happen within those systems, that's orchestration too. And I think truly you need a buy and build strategy. There are parts of that you may, and for good reason, end up building yourself, but there is a big buy component to it, because it should not be something you go in and do in your own endeavor. And then there's actually one thing, and sometimes I describe this as being the white space in your architecture. That is orchestration. Like if you were to draw out a composable architecture, you often draw like a bunch of circles, and then you draw a bunch of circles for the heads. And the front end, what about the rest? In a monolithic architecture, that was the runtime of the monolith.
Yeah.
Shared database, it's the actual runtime of the solution and so on. That white space is what we need to fill with something flexible, not glue, but something flexible. And there's a best of breed approach to choosing the right pieces to put into that white space. The orchestration for the front end, for the experience, the low code, no code, proper tooling for observability and health, for the actual correlation and tracing. Like there's a bunch of components that goes into that white space. It's not a single solution either.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you mentioned the monolith and the fact that technically on the monolith model, their claim to fame and why they've worked so well historically is that they did have orchestration built in. They orchestrated all of their systems together, and you bought the platform and it was like, wow, this is all orchestrated very nicely and working together. The trick now came with composability, where people are trying to swap things in and out, because that was a locked orchestration kind of model that was like for those.
I don't 100% agree with you, John. Like, I think one of the reasons why we moved away from DXP was because as soon as you started to use more than like a couple of the features, then they didn't actually work as well as people thought.
I think each feature didn't work for the use case of that customer. I think they worked well together, but the use case for that specific customer, for that platform, e-commerce or whatever that component may be, wouldn't work.
Yeah, and okay, so kind of splitting hairs on that, but yes. So what happened? And I think that's one of the reasons we have a lot of folks that are still using DXPs, because they actually do work for their specific use case, but they can't change. And I think one of the things we get caught up on composability and orchestration is talking about swapping systems out. I think we talk about that too much, because people don't really want to swap systems. They just want to get the right one for their
work together.
There are some systems that are more swappable than others. A tax system in a commerce stack, that's a market condition. There's a compliance element. In a global enterprise, you're orchestrating multiple of those. And you're doing it for good reason, whereas there are other systems that simply aren't swapped as much.
And so, like, what we really want to be able to swap out is like probably either add more front ends. Like, I want to put my content in front of more people in different places, TVs and phones and whatever, that was a thing. But I also want to change that as that technology evolves, because it evolves really quickly. And I think that's where we saw this happen, like in around 2018 was where, like with Jamstack, folks were like, I want to swap that out and get onto new versions. And people that have started doing that are like, they're on new versions like the day they're out, with like versions of things like Net.js or whatever. Whereas our customers that are on .NET, they're still on .NET from like 2014. They don't change that. So it's interesting that it is a real mindset shift to kind of get into this. But I haven't seen as much of a mindset shift for, say that 10 times fast, mindset shift, for getting into orchestration and composability. So it's like, it's a harder one to get into, and I'm not sure why. And I know that for me, this leads a little bit into Netlify, because I looked at how Gatsby did their data layer. It made you do a data layer based on GraphQL that actually pulled your data into that thing and then changed it. And to me, I hated it at first, because it meant that, I like the way I do data. I don't want to do this big GraphQL thing. But then it actually forced me to think about that data, that content in a slightly different way, and look at, we can pull all of this stuff into this layer. It's actually stored there, which is a little weird, but it's fine. And then it was used. And I think Netlify, I'm segueing into your stuff here a little bit, Chris, but that to me was a mindset shift for me personally, for how I was helping to help customers work with their stuff. But I'm not sure that I agree with actually storing all the data in the orchestration layer.
Can I actually help you out on that one, Chris?
Just a second, because you get your little snippet in there, and then Chris, we want to hear from you.
No, definitely. But I would just do want to add something to this. So I think there is two parts to orchestration. One is to make the data that you have in the back end available to be orchestrated with an API. And then the other part is to actually do the orchestration, like stitching the data together and connecting the dots, and actually giving the front end a view into the back end data, right? So those two are two different things. Even in our platform, we actually have two modules. One is very similar to Netlify Connect, which opens up the back end data, especially from legacy systems that currently don't have APIs. to make them available for orchestration. And then the second part is the real-time engine that is actually going and pulling data live from different systems, stitching it together, and then making it available to the front end in a way that the front end requires it to map to the data model and the object model of the front end. So I think when we're talking about it, because a lot of times this issue gets confused, and I want to separate those two capabilities within orchestration. And now, Chris, with that.
Yeah, what's your take on this one?
No, so I think the original question back then was when is orchestration a good idea, right?
Like again, a layer, like a specific layer that needs to be built.
Yeah. So I mean,
the front end.
So the first thing is let's look at the traditional way of bringing things together and bringing something live, right? You need to pull in your CMS and your content and your payment and all those different microservices, right? Then you need to bring them into one build. And then, once that published, you have your system administrators that needs to spin up staging environments, right? They have their own ticketing systems. They have their own sprints. You have the same for database administrators. Now you have DevOps sitting varnish caching. Now you have infrastructure engineers doing all those things, right? And that's why it takes 4 months to move that blue block from here to here, right? And it's sort of, I think that's the first thing that Netlify also went out to solve for, right? Because otherwise we would, Paul Graham once said, the founder of Y Combinator, that this way of building was the fixie bike of the internet, as in it had a solo use case, right? It had one gear only. And it was true because there wasn't an ecosystem, right? But also because there was no viable workflow. There was no orchestration. And so Netlify was sort of the first attempt at being able to orchestrate all of that into one workflow, right? And so even if you just have, let's say, contemporary comms tools and it's a greenfield project, you can go and click a button and be done, right? Or you can build out something that really will take a lot of cycles to do the same, right? And then I think when we talk about the next level of orchestration, then I think when you have, like, for example, we work with companies that have, one of them has 600 brands in 200 countries. So you can imagine the number of digital executions that are unique they put out every year. It's about 100,000, right? And so if someone comes and tries to pitch them one solution, like one CMS, they smile, right? Because what about these developers in Brazil that's never heard of your product and can't get relevant developers and so on, right? And so when they're trying to, now we have hundreds and hundreds of different properties that run on very different components of MACH that is run with Netlify. And they sort of wanted to say, okay, well, how do I get that workflow, right? This abstraction, a way of having to run all that operations around infrastructure. There's such huge saves in it. Our time to market is a fraction of what it was. On average, with Netlify, enterprise clients deploy 28 times a day, and that's up for once a week before us, right? It's not because the software is 150 times faster. I really wish it was, right? But it's because of how much is automated and abstracted away. So, well, can we get the same guardrails and governance and compliance and the developer provisionings and so on, but across different kinds of projects, right? That aren't just MACH, but maybe some of them are more legacy and starting to get headless, and having a workflow and an orchestration out there where it's more sort of saying, hey, we have all this product data in a spreadsheet. We want to, I don't know why it does that. Sorry. I don't know. I can't turn it off, right? And I speak with my hands, which is an issue for me, right? But that has to travel through and be easily accessible. And like you have vastly different content sources, right? And so when you mentioned Gatsby for that middleware, right? When we looked around, they were the first ones actually trying to solve this. And so that's why it's now part of Netlify, and we brought it out as, kept building on that and making Netlify Connect, right? It's also why we have something as Netlify Create, the stack bit, which was saying that the visual editing, which I think, and that's a great example, right? Of saying, hey, if you have one content management system and that has a visual editor, that's native to that content management system. It's much better to use that. I would suggest that myself, to be honest, right? But once you start pulling from different content sources, that's when something like that can really start making sense, right? And I think that's the notion, right? The more you have to orchestrate, and you do, if you're trying to approach this, adopt this at scale, the more you need that next layer of orchestration, right? But even for a greenfield singular project, you will definitely need orchestration in order to succeed, right? So it's just like, what kind of orchestration are we talking about, right? And at scale, you're going to need more than that. And I would say for the no-code low-code, one thing that really interests me is this notion that traditionally in enterprise software, right? We all come from a place where things were sold over the top of developers. They had no buy-in. They're just like, hey, this is what we're using, right?
Yeah.
There's this notion that well, there's a few sort of specialized IT experts and admins that know sort of how it works and they can help out with this, right? And I think the reality is that once we are really starting to sell to enterprises that are doing this at scale, the version of real no-code doesn't exist to the extent that you don't have to open the lid. They all do, right? You will have to come in. And so it really matters what that code looks like and how the development process is, how is it built? Does it fit into your Git workflows? Does it fit into everything else, right? I think even in our no-code experiences today, understanding modern development, understanding how developers work, making sure it fits into how they're developing everything else becomes super important, right? Because I do think that there's no-code applications out there that are great if it could keep no-code, but as soon as the lid is open, it's sort of like, what do we do with this, right? Like we don't even have someone speaking that programming language or whatever it might be, right? So I think there's actual real code considerations in no-code applications as well to take into consideration. More so than they used to be, right? When I started my career, that wasn't really the case, right? You were just looking at it from a different functionality point of view. But yeah, I think short answer, orchestration is important in the very beginning and at scale, but different considerations around the orchestration is required.
Yeah, and I think you just said one thing that I really resonate with, which is like the more complex your orchestration has to be, the more likely you need a very robust layer, and that just scales up from there. But also, Sanna, you said one thing around, legacy systems and things like that, and we're seeing a huge amount of people look towards orchestration or an orchestration layer specifically when they're trying to either combine, like what you said, Chris, a whole bunch of systems across multiple countries and things where they don't want to standardize because each country maybe has their own needs for certain things, or they have a legacy system, whether it's a DXP or some other system that they're just like, we're not ready to move this, but we need to move faster over here, and we need these to work together and talk together and things like that, and even our teams to work better together, as you were saying, Casper. So my question to you guys is, as we're seeing lots of people use orchestration to connect legacy systems with my kind of, I would say, more MACH compliant systems that are like have that methodology right off the bat, do you guys think this is hurting or helping the growth of MACH? Right? Like going into that direction of MACH is like, everything should be swappable, everything should be API based. We're trying to get into more of a standards based model. Maybe Joel, you want to hit this one first and just let us know, like, what do you think in terms of, is this slowing down MACH and the adoption of it, or is this helping?
I think there's two things that I've seen in my experience. One is where an enterprise organization wants to move faster. And so we have like our existing, not only monolith, but sort of old school tech stack, but we're going to do this project because we need to do it fast. And we're going to do some new technology on there. I think a lot of times folks are fooling themselves if they think that's a true pilot project to replace everything else because they haven't changed their mindset. But those pilot projects, in my experience, always work awesome. And folks are like, well, why can we do this so fast? But if I want to make one change over here, like you were saying, Chris, it's like, I need a 60-day release cycle. Like, that's crap. And so nobody wants that, right? And so that's when we get into more of the headless conversation and how can we move this throughout the enterprise. It's really hard for folks to understand that not all of this is the CMS because they're used to it all being in a DXP. And so, well, that's the CMS. It's like, no, that's not. That's, you actually want to bring in all these other things. So that's that part of the conversation. But then my fear is that if folks won't understand, especially when they have an orchestration layer in the middle between like the CMS, the orchestration layer, and then all the front ends, is that now there's even more separation between the content that folks are working with and the front end. And that's a really hard leap for folks to get over, even with just basic headless CMS. And it comes back to what you're talking about, Chris, even with like StackBit and like those visual creators. And I think a lot of orchestration platforms are actually becoming visual creators themselves because just solving that for a customer to say, this is where your content, what it looks like in terms of like structured content. And now you can know exactly where it goes in the front end. That is one of the hardest problems to solve, that orchestration seems to even make a little worse. And so like, does it make it, yes, John, it does make it harder for folks to adopt MACH because it's like just this one more complication. And honestly, it makes me wonder, well, maybe there should be a tighter integration between the headless CMS and an orchestration layer, or like where should all that live? And so I think we need to revisit the visualization of that a little more.
Right, nice. What about you, Chris? What's your thought on that one? Do you think it's slowing down and hurting the adoption?
No, I think it's necessary, right? I think that when I see pushback against MACH installations and composable architecture, again, it's not, when I isolate it, it's not because that component, that headless CMS or the commerce solution was sold on the fund's premises. It's because of how it coexists with all the other stack, and maybe the right stakeholders weren't included in this, right? And it's stuck in an infrastructure and a way of doing operations and orchestrations that was built around a very different use case, right?
Yeah.
And so that's often where it halts, right? Almost always, that's when the pushback, I can isolate it from that. So I do think that this orchestration is absolutely necessary. And I also think that, again, we saw the orchestration when there was 2 companies, and now there's 3,500 companies in the space, right? And it's just growing, and it came because of viable workflows, right? So I don't think it's hurting as such, right? I do think there's complexity, but again, like the example of our client that I just mentioned with 600 brands in 200 countries, right? I mean, like, there was complexity before. They were just not even part of the same equation. They were completely siloed out. They're just paying to reinvent the wheel everywhere, right? Country managers just putting in spreadsheets because it's so randomized what they're doing. There's no sort of joint red thread throughout their projects, right? They basically might have a bit of joint Google Analytics here and there, but that was it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this is actually something that's joining those things. But yes, there's a complexity here. I think the right orchestration will only help, though, at scale, to minimize that and make it easier, right? We always say that especially in a front end, that's extremely iterative, right? So if you look at an ERP at the other end, like that's so much, such a heavy thing, right? It's every 10 years or something like that, right?
Yeah.
A front end is not a boil, there's a new framework every week, right? So our job at Netlify has always been, for example, say, hey, we need to make sure that we work with anything, right? We need to make it easy for companies to I don't know.
I love it.
To use any component, right? And to discontinue it as well, right? Like, to really deliver on that promise of interchangeability and faster time to market, you know? And there we go. There we go. And so I think, like, I don't think necessarily that it's hurting, but I do think that the integration between these things are extremely important, right?
Yeah.
And we also said, is it watering out sort of the MACH promise, like saying, hey, this is not pure MACH? No, I don't think so. Actually, I think it makes MACH more viable, right? That it can coexist in something that doesn't have to be like 100% pure, right?
You don't have to start from scratch to get into MACH, right? You can continue
and
which is actually part of the promise. Like, I
absolutely
use things.
Yeah,
I absolutely think I think it's a necessity too. And I think what we're forgetting is that within an enterprise, many architectures exist. These are by channel, by market, by whatever dimension that organization represent. MACH equals incrementality.
Yes.
Okay, it's an ecosystem approach.
Yeah.
It means MACH lives next to legacy for a while and for a long time, and maybe for longer than we all want to.
Maybe forever, because the current things that are now may become legacy later, right?
So I think it's an enabler. I don't think it's a threat. It is easing the path. It creates viability in places where potentially before you didn't have, meaning I think it's only going to exponentially be more important because of it, to be honest, because again, working within an enterprise and thinking of MACH as an insular thing, that's not fair. You need to think about the ecosystem approach and the breadth and the scalability consideration that goes into it too. And there will be a legacy component that you need to lean up against to some degree, and you need to make sure that doesn't slow you down. Right? Because you still need
I know, Santa, you guys work with lots of people with like that's one of your big use cases, helping people keep their legacy system going until they're either ready to move from it or don't.
Yeah, and today's and just in the financial economic landscape, a lot of companies aren't ready to move off of those legacy systems. And when we define legacy as well, I'm pretty careful in terms of what I call legacy, right? Just because something's an all-in-one platform doesn't make it legacy.
100%.
It just provides a lot of different functionality, and as long as that functionality is being exposed properly through APIs, and every part of that platform is available to developers and to to implementers and SIs through APIs. It's not a legacy system. What I call legacy is when something does not have an easy way to integrate with. It's extremely slow, it's brittle, it's going to break down any minute. In that scenario, there are times when you need an orchestration platform to sit on top of it to extend its lifeline a little bit more. And sometimes, so even within legacy systems, I would say there are two types. There are those that actually provide APIs, but the APIs are just slow. And then there are those that don't provide APIs at all, and the data is just stuck in those systems. So there are two different approaches to deal with those platforms. Just because something doesn't or provides an API, but it's slow, doesn't actually make it okay to pull the data out of that system and put it into another system either. I actually don't believe personally that that's the right way. And the reason is that there is logic that is built into those legacy systems that are not just data. There's business logic that needs to be accessed in real time as well. I'll give you an example of a customer recently that signed up with us that has an Oracle database with 2,000 different stored procedures that need to be accessed, and that those stored procedures have tons and tons of logic sitting in it. You can't take those 2,000 stored procedures out and re-implement that in a serverless function in 6 months to recreate that logic somewhere else. So in that case, you can't take the data out either, because the data needs to stay in there. The logic is in there. We just need to get access to it fast, and we need to be able to cache the queries that go to it, to that system. And that's why our solution, the DX engine, provides that caching layer as well, without actually moving the data, without moving the business logic. You're sitting on top of it and accessing the business logic in real time. Now, their plan, though, is to take, one bit at a time, that logic that they used to have in that Oracle database, pull that out and put that into Consia in our rules engine, because it's just a bunch of rules that are sitting in there. But they don't want to do it. They can't do it. Let's just say they can't do it in a short period of time. So you need to provide them that transition plan. And as Casper was saying, we have to be open to the idea of living beside existing systems. I'm not going to call them all legacy, because they're not all legacy. They just may not be MACH compliant. But as long as there's a way to work with them and make the business happy at the end of the day, the customer happy, that's really what we should be all focusing on. And I think that is the value of MACH. That is the principle by which MACH, that's what it addresses, is that incremental shift towards a modern architecture, right?
I think people are very, very quick to try to replace systems, right? They want to wipe it out. They want to start from scratch. It's a mentality of I want to come in and make my mark and wipe things out. But the question really to ask before you just wipe out a system is that system hindering my business, my orchestration of my team, my members that are doing their work? Can they get their work done? Can the strategy come down, and can the business still execute? Or is that system hindering an actual business operation or a strategy or some type of execution that's necessary? And those cases, then you need to step back and say, okay, this is slowing us down. This is stopping us. And one of the things we've noticed as people move to headless CMS over the years, and that idea of modeling your content and making it content first and all these things, was the fact that they didn't actually have a role in the company that owned that architecture. And so they would buy these headless CMS and be like, I need a headless CMS, or I need this type of solution. They'd buy it, and they wouldn't have the right mindset of people to architect and build the architectures in a way that was reusable. So they build it once, and then they'd be like, well, this isn't expandable, or this doesn't want to do what I want to do the next 3 months down the road. So transitioning from our experience in the CMS world and how people haven't put enough horsepower or people resources towards architecting properly and looking at that as an actual role, do you guys feel that a new role is necessary that needs to own this orchestration layer? And is it one role? Is it a team? How do you I think, Chris, you said it a couple of times, or maybe it was you, Casper, said most of the time these things fail because it was rolled out incorrectly. The orchestration was done incorrectly. And even if you buy a system center like yours and implement it, if it's not built right or configured right, you can still run into problems. So
Absolutely.
to recap, do we need another role? Do businesses need to allocate this to someone? Is it one person's responsibility or is it a team?
It's a mindset. Like I truly believe it's a mindset shift, because
Yes.
all you want, you can design your content model, content first, and leverage or allow you to leverage content across channels. But if you don't appreciate the user, meaning the customer, in doing that, then you're failing in the first place.
Yeah.
The message might be the same, but the message will be wrong.
Yes.
Like that doesn't make your world any better. So it's a mindset shift. No, it's not a single person, and neither should you buy more technology simply to solve for it.
100%.
You need to put training, you need to put change into your organization, right? And with the content modeling comes the appreciation of the impact, the responsibility, the purpose of content, and that needs to match the customer at the end of the day. So it gets shot into the right channel at the right time.
Yeah.
So that's not a single person's job.
And I think to jump onto that, Casper, is like that's one of another good reason to do like incremental adoption, which is why orchestration can really help you with that, because you don't have to throw out all the old tools before you start adopting new ones.
Shouldn't, absolutely not.
Yes.
But you need to get the foundation right as well, because what you're also talking about, John, is channel agnostic modeling versus channel centric modeling. In being, you can take a headless CMS and you can start to model pages within it. What you're getting is still a WCMS, like in the good old days. That doesn't make it headless. Well, okay, it doesn't have a head, but it's still web centric in how you actually think about your content. You need to get the foundation right, but you need to find a good place to experiment. You need to find a good place to unlock value. You need to find a good place to increment. Whether that ends up being the website at first, that's great. Is it an app?
Typically will be.
Is it a voice interface? That's perfect too, right? But think about the mindset shift that is required to make sure you can scale that experiment.
Yeah, and one other thing that I've seen also, another example for recent customer is that they had built, they were using one of the headless CMSs to to model their content. They have like over 100 spaces of one particular CMS, and they have built all of the logic for the experience. So all their pages, they're like thousands of pages in the front end, and all of those pages are modeled right inside the CMS as a content model, right? And so content and presentation are completely intertwined. The front end is looking for certain, like very specific content items from the back end that represent that particular layout and the way the CSS is modeled, the way the layout is modeled. So just going back to, Casper, what you said about the mindset, most organizations to this day, from my experience talking to various folks now, they see the CMS as the central orchestrator of experiences. Whether you mean it has been. Yeah. So this is kind of funny, because we started with a WCMS, we broke it down, we said, okay, we're going to go to like headless CMS. And now the headless CMSs go back and say, you know what, we need a visual layer. But now we're going to tie the visual layer right into our headless content models. So now we went full circle in a way. And in some ways we're doing the right thing because we've actually managed to at least separate out the presentation.
That's the important bit.
Concept.
There's still separation. Yeah.
As long as there's separation. But
there's also a definition of presentation. So people get very confused. Is a page presentation, or is it just a structure of content? And then, or is a page, or is presentation CSS and design, or your design system? So people get
as long as your content, as long as the content is built in such a way, the structure of the content is built in a way that it can be reused across different 100%. Displays, different screens, different web pages, and whatnot. And even like I know in Agility, for example, you guys have a concept of layouts, but that's okay. One vendor providing a solution to both presentation and content management is not a bad thing. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is when you tie them together in such a way that no other head can call your content anymore. You can't expose your content in a headless fashion anymore because you've tied it to a certain page structure and certain, models for the front end. And I think, and that's another confusion that a lot of people have. They think that, just because you have a vendor that is providing a presentation layer as well, they're now a monolith. That is absolutely not the case. You just have to make sure that that presentation layer is separated. There's a separation of concerns, even if it's talking to your own headless CMS. That's okay to do it.
I'm going to let Joel jump in here because I want him to, he's going to have a rebuttal on the presentation layer, because what is the presentation layer is the question. Because you're right, a lot of headless CMSs actually have preview and edit in place, and all these things are all popping up. But is the HTML, wherever that's rendering, is that in the CMS or isn't it? And is that the presentation layer, or is the where the content goes?
Confusion, mass confusion.
I mean, 100% agree, Casper, that like being able to switch out the front end is like top priority, because those front end frameworks are evolving really fast, and we don't want everyone stuck on .NET from 10 years ago. We want people on the latest and greatest that can do the best things. But in terms of like you talked about a different role, John. Folks do need that content strategist, content architect role, and if you're the person that's in that role, thank God for you. But your job then, that person's job, is to make sure that we keep the code out of the content. First of all, don't let code get in there, and that might mean HTML, although that's a kind of a gray area. You know what I mean? Depending on that. We can argue about that one all day, but it's like we don't want to have. I prefer not to have any CSS in the content, right? Because it's not gonna scale well. So we want, but also, should there be design specific terminology or fields in there? At the very least, like what Agility does, we keep them separate. Like there's code that is meant to be shared everywhere and it has nothing about the design in it, and there's other code or other content, I should say, that has some design, and a knowledge of the layout that's going to be used at. Mostly because that's how people think with CMS. So we just like, hey, that's how you're thinking, we'll let you do it. But it keeps us a very clear segmentation between those two kinds of content. And that's really important. And I think orchestration works better on the non-design content.
Agreed. Yeah.
I don't agree with the orchestration layer then repeating, and having like essentially a front end, hey, this is where each thing is going to go on each page. Because that doesn't help.
I agree. So, and I think that, Joel, that's actually a very important point as well. There is a distinction between composition and orchestration, right? So Gartner's current, category of digital experience composition, that is like a visual canvas where the business user is laying out a page and deciding how big or small certain visual components are going to be, and like mapping out the pixels on the page. That is composition. All orchestration is supposed to do is give the data to the front end in the way the front end needs it to bind to the front end components. It should not be the one telling the front end, oh, you should put that component at the bottom of the page.
Right.
That defeats the purpose.
One weird thing there is you talked about data and going someplace. Data often needs to change depending on where it's going.
Yes, exactly. So the
data has to have enough data about where it's going to know what to put in the data. You know what I mean?
I'll give you an example.
This is where the cycle comes for customers and things like this, and that's where orchestration and how you compose that to something gets very, very complex.
So orchestration, like I can speak to our platform. One of the things that we do, for example, if you have a web front end and you have a specific page with 5 different components on that page, and those 5 components have a specific object model to them. So header banner is, title, CTA, image, right? What we're giving to the front end is that header, like that title, CTA, and that image, even though from Contentful or from Agility or Content Stack, you may have this massive, data model coming back that is not needed by the front end. We're essentially transforming that data on the way out to give the front end exactly the pieces of information that are required for that page. And if there's another channel that says, I don't need those 3, I need these 5 fields, then you give those 5 fields to that front end. But we still don't tell the front end that you should use this CSS. You can pass a design instruction to the front end.
Completely separate. I agree. It's
or layout or
there's a whole class of users that use. I have to say, we have a whole class of customers that essentially use the CMS to bypass DevOps. That's one of the reasons people use, because like I think Chris, you were talking about, hey, push into production once a week. That's a really, like, for code, for some organizations, push into production once every 60 days is something that they do for code, and which is why, you know, from the CMS, their marketing team puts all kinds of code in their content, because that's the only way they can get it on their website, which is terrible. I don't love the idea, but that was the use case they needed to solve. And I want to get back to more. We're talking about mindset, weren't we?
We're talking about do we actually need a user role? Like, do you need to hire someone for that role? And I also really want Chris to give an opinion here, because we're getting tight on time, and I should make sure he gets a voice here, because he's rolling out a system for customers. And does someone need to configure that and manage that and own that? I think his perspective would be really good on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a few things mentioned here, right? I think, yeah, one thing is absolutely, I think, as I said before, the front end is really iterative, right? Our focus is to say everything that's needed for components to talk to each other, and everything that's needed to remove friction so you can use that new AI component, or that new version of, a Figma that includes a VS Code, right? Where all, design becomes code, right? I think frameworks are already trying to automate parts of a standard that says HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I think we're going to see a bunch of AI in there. And the reality is, if you look at this as an enterprise, the one thing that you can be sure of is that it's impossible to pick a winner right now. So our focus at Netlify is to make it as easy and frictionless as possible to use any component, any framework, and also discontinue it, right? I think the other thing you mentioned was this notion of is it the responsibility of one person, right? And I don't think it is. I think it is much more of an org thing, right? But at this point, like, we have 4.5 million businesses and developers on the platform. We run more than 35 million store sites and apps on Netlify, right? And over all these years, of course, we've seen companies go from a small landing page to everything, right? And that comes back to the most beautiful promise of MACH, composability, headless, jams, like all of it, right? This decoupled approach is the ability to gradually migrate, right? 100%. This notion that you can do things at a time, right? And so we have companies today that runs on basically every CMS in MACH Alliance, and then some, all natively headless. Some are not natively headless as well, and not part of MACH yet, right? And they use that, right? They use different commerce systems. They have, apps that runs on fitness bikes, right? And then they have developer documentation, one of marketing pages, and .coms that have huge amounts of enterprise stakeholders and plugs into everything from Hotspot to Salesforce and so on, right? And we provide a common connective tissue for all of it, right? And that was completely unheard of before. And what it means is that all those silos have been broken down. Their time to market, as I said, is many-fold increased, right? And that really, really, really makes a difference. And I think it does so because our exclusive focus is orchestration, right? It is making sure that you can connect the dots, but it's up to you what dots you want connecting, right? And I really believe that's the way and the path forward, right? But yeah, if I could say a last thing, regardless of which approach you have, right? I do hope that what you take away from us here on the call is that orchestration really, really is an integral part of success of composable at scale that you can't do without.
Yeah. Well, I really value everyone's opinions here. All of you have been in the industry for a long time. You've watched the evolution. You've watched, people, as you said, Sandra, at the beginning, people have been orchestrating since day one, orchestration and pulling systems together. But now it's becoming top of mind, and people are realizing without doing this properly, you will not succeed properly on your direction and movement to MACH and those architectures. So I want to thank everyone for being a part of this. I know, Sandra, you want to say one last thing, don't you?
Oh, no, I'm good. I think I said my last words already.
I feel we could go on for another hour. There's so many topics, there's so many things, and we almost got off topic there a little bit with content architecture and headless and those things like that. And but thanks to you, everyone, for joining in and watching us. Thank you, as the speakers here, panelists. I think you guys have so much more. We'll have to figure out another topic, because I think we could go off in some crazy tangents and other things. So have a great rest of your week, everyone, and thank you for attending.
Thanks, folks.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.